Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Now, there's been a number of issues with Disc Priest throughout Dragonflight, to say the least, but none more so than where the spec stands in Raid. In this video, I want to talk about where Disc has come from in previous iterations of the spec, how certain Dragonflight classes look to be a success, and really what they should be doing with Disc for maybe 10.17, 10.2 to actually fix this problem. Some of the things are a little bit outside of their control. I've talked about it before in previous videos about the strength of healers. And while that impacts the damage that you're having to heal up, whether it's raids, mythic plus, whatever, it also does a lot to determine which healers are actually strong based off of how they are healing. Disc, of course, having the most unique of healing styles for a long time, was all about ramping. And when you see some of the footage from like Battle for Azeroth, I think this is really going to kind of clue you into where Disc's downfall has been over the years, is that players stayed at low levels of health, low percentages of health, for very long periods of time, because the strength of healers relative to health pools was very low. Even as essences and later on corruption in Battle for Azeroth really amplified the strength of healers across the board, it was still taking large quantities of time to push up health pools, and so that when Disc, following up with its standard Rapture into Evangelism ramps back in the day, you still were taking a greater period of time to push those health bars up to full, which meant that all of the damage that you were dealing was contributing towards healing, and it was all taking time to be able to top players off. As opposed to where we stand today, and even in parts of Shadowlands as well, where it was so easy to bring a health pool up to full, even outside of your cooldowns, that you were very easily able to sort of like snipe away at other healers' raid cooldowns if they're not as focused or bursty as you might like. A good example of this is Preservation Evoker. Preservation in Dragonflight has really bursty ramp sequences with like Stasis. The benefit of Spirit Bloom with their tier set is insanely powerful. In Season 1, it was all about like the Emerald Communion Lifebind combination effects with Temporal Anomaly, and it happened fast. Much faster than Discipline's ramp sequences, both in BFA and, of course, in Dragonflight. Even in Shadowlands, the 10-second duration of Boon of the Ascended took a long amount of time to be able to reach completion. And as healers got stronger in Sepulchre, that also led to, a devaluation, you could say, of Disc Priest. Now, one of the biggest things that they could be doing to be able to immediately buff Disc would absolutely be nerfing healers, but we've already seen how that's gone because it's also amplifying the damage at the exact same time. You can even see from some of our footage on N'Zoth, and this might be a dedicated video in and of itself, but we have around 500,000 health as we're fighting N'Zoth at the end of Battle for Azeroth. We have essences, we have corruption, we have all these strengths, and we're still not doing as much healing as we are doing in Dragonflight. And so the ability to push health pools up so rapidly has a significant impact on the meta, but it's not the only thing that is impacting it. Discipline is very much plagued, in my opinion, by a gross and bloated talent tree. I think a good way to be able to draw a foil between this is where Holy Paladin currently stands post-rework. This isn't any optimal raid build by any means, but I think this is a good one that can highlight where Discipline could actually end up being by leveraging what's already in the tree at the moment. Most notably, you never run any of these Lights of Wrath talents underneath the actual ability itself. You never run Resplendent Light or Wrath Unleashed in a raiding environment. There's a little bit of time where we used it in like Season 1 super early, but it just wasn't as strong as some of the other options because unlike Preservation Evoker, Discipline is not as bursty with a couple of its hardest hitting abilities, like namely Light's Wrath. And as a result, it would need more time to be able to get the full extent and value of its ramp to be able to achieve really worthwhile HPS to be worth bringing in a raiding environment. But if other healers are able to be burstier and they can produce a greater overall amount for less work and less time standing still, whatever, then, those are just going to be better healers, obviously. But I can absolutely dream of an area where Discipline is able to simplify down a lot of its ramp sequence in some ways. Now, BFA had ramps that were very similar to what we have today, where you're hitting Rapture into Evangelism, apply your atonements. Sometimes you could split Rapture and Evangelism, kind of the same thing as it is today. You had those options, you did your ramps, you went there. The way that you utilized your atonement application was extraordinarily similar. And as a result, it kind of just came down to how you timed your abilities. In Shadowlands, it went to the Covenant abilities to deal damage. And now in Dragonflight, it's this monstrous amalgamation of 12 different damage spells, 10 different damage spells, to be able to actually leverage value out of Atonement. Almost double the amount that we had in Battle for Azeroth. And if they're going to have any sort of rework or revamp for Disc, and I hope it's a revamp and not some support augmenter like people have been suggesting, I think that'd be terrible. It would have to look something like leveraging the value out of Light's Wrath to make the spec on a competitive level towards like Preservation Evoker with the burstiness of the spec. And namely, they can do that by going down the Light's Wrath tree, because these talents are so insanely raid focused that it would be the perfect independent variable to not mess with the Mythic Plus builds that exist that, from everything I've heard, a lot of Disc Priests are quite happy with. And so you could actually have these routes very focused into Light's Wrath that would benefit raiding Disc Priests without having to mess with what the Mythic Plus Disc Priests, the Mythic Plus mains have going on at the moment. And you can do it in a number of different ways that would also, again, be beneficial to Mythic Plus. Namely, this is, again, not an original idea, it's heard it a million times, but merging Schism into Shadow Covenant. Having the 15% damage buff out of Schism in a 35% or 25%, depending on the talent you take, damage buff for your shadow spells with Shadow Covenant is just so much burst and value that you're forced into this scenario where you have to front load all these extra modifier spells before you can actually cast your real damage spells. This is so much work and nonsense that it's just incredibly frustrating to be able to deal with. Personally, I don't even think we should have Shadow Covenant, and that a lot of this value should be baked into other talents instead, perhaps Light's Wrath as well. Schism as an early sort of modifier before you do your other damage spells feels good, but then having Schism and Shadow Covenant, which accomplish the same things, just feels like extra bloat that we don't need. Mind Blast, in another case, it's kind of fun to be able to merge into like extending the duration of your Bender. It's nice to be able to have it like chewing up your Purge the Wicked, but it also ends up in being very bloaty. And you could also just leave Shadow or Death in its place and just have it do that instead, and it have that ability in Shadow or Death be the only one that does it instead, so that when you enter into execute phase, you're adjusting your gameplay accordingly, and instead of always having all kinds of Purge the Wicked uptime, then the gameplay accelerates, and then you have to micro it more with an ability like Expiation. And having it relegated just to execute phase instead of something you're constantly dealing with, I think would be a lot better for the game itself. I do think for the vast majority of players, having Aegis of Wrath, getting rid of this decay effect would be incredibly nice. I'm not really sure why it exists to begin with. I don't think there's any other healer spec in the game right now that has this sort of like negative side effect to how these shields work. I get that they want to make sure that shielding is not overly powerful in the game, but I really don't think that's something they should be concerned about since they gave absorbs to Evoker for free. Basically, I don't think that this could be in any sort of trouble. I think it's appropriate to have Divine Aegis kind of trimmed down so it doesn't get out of hand. But absorbs are also central to where discipline lies. And they did end up making absorbs a very large part of BFA disc with no cooldown on the shields. And we still sparingly weaved it in and still just got pretty good shield value out of regular uses of Rapture. I don't think that we need to go into any nonsense with Spirit Shell and oppress everybody else, but I think the vast majority of players who have enjoyed playing Disc over the years liked that it was an option, and where we stand at the moment, it doesn't really end up feeling like one. And that's probably one of the biggest reasons why Revamp, similar to Holy Paladins, could be really beneficial. One of the big things I hope you notice with the Holy Paladin Revamp is specifically this final tier. Now, you're only able to have 10 points in the final tier of all the spec trees, and the most noticeable thing about it is the lack of 2-point spells. When it comes down to Veneration, Crusader's Might, your option nodes, everything is a one-of-one talent with minimal like downsides or sacrifices that you have on hand. In fact, I'd argue you kind of get everything you could possibly want out of the Paladin tree. It's like you have a number of really powerful abilities in things like Tears, Daybreak, and I've talked about it in other videos. This isn't a Holy Pally video. You have these very, very powerful abilities, and you always have access to them, and you can always route into them, and they're very flexible for raids and Mythic Plus in how you can leverage them. And there's a heap of talent options available to you. Whether you want to go Barrier of Faith or Reclamation, whether you want to go Awakening, Sanctified Wrath, whether you want to go into Inflorescence or Empyrean Legacy, you have a lot of options to be able to choose between rather than having sacrifices that you have to choose this or that. And I think that's one of the things that Discipline severely lacks when it comes to their talent tree, is they're chock full of 2-pointers. You're chocked into 2-pointers for absorbs, 2-pointers to make your penance stronger, 2-pointers to be able to yield more value out of some of your most frequently cast abilities and things like Mind Blast and Death, consuming your Purge the Wicked. It is so much point investment, which also feels like you're not getting a lot for that point investment as well. Players putting 2 points into Divine Aegis don't feel like they're getting the same level of value that a Holy Paladin would be getting by putting a point into Tears and then a point into Unbound Salvation to more than double, actually triple the duration of Tears Deliverance. It's insanely powerful. And yet we don't feel, I would say by and large as Disc Priests, like any of these massive point investitures that we have to put in are really yielding a lot of value, and it becomes more bloat and frustration to be able to leverage good value out of them anyway. For Harsh Discipline, when you have both points in, it's Forecast of Solace Smite, whatever it is, that you have to prepare before you begin your ramp sequence. Expiation, make sure that you have to constantly be refreshing your Purge the Wicked well earlier than you may have expected, because you have to consume it when you're dealing the brunt of your damage. There is so much front loading and preparation into the spec that also doesn't feel duly rewarded on the back end. And one of the biggest ways that they could fix this is by subbing to the YouTube channel, because we have all kinds of content to be able to help all healers out. But they could also be doing it by having a similar revamp to Holy Paladins, where they can actually have a divergence between raid builds and Mythic Plus builds. Having the divergence between heavy Mindbender damage-oriented abilities, and even making things like Inescapable Torment deal 5 target atonement healing to be able to better leverage itself in a 5-man environment, while then also having absorb effects and powerful burst in Light's Wrath to be able to leverage into a raiding environment. So that way you are going to be in the raid and not on the bench as a raiding Disc Priest, or not be pushed to reroll to something else in the process. There's a lot that they could be doing to trim down what I would say is the bloat of Disc, which is having 10, 11 damaging abilities to yield value from Atonement, as well as preparation abilities like Shadow Covenant, or the unnecessary complication of having to like prep up Expiation, Harsh Discipline value, even Twilight Equilibrium to modify your spell sequences. There's a lot that they could trim down there, while also making more one-of-one abilities or more choice nodes for Disc that actually feel like they have a difference to them, that actually feel like they have value. The only choice node that actually is available for Disc is on the bottom rung here, between Lenience and Evangelism, which has been such a ridiculous choice node for, I don't know, the past 5 or 6 years. Where, yeah, I mean, of course you're just going to take some damage reduction when you go into keys, it's better than nothing. And of course you're going to take Atonement Extension on a 1.5-minute cooldown, which is pretty good, but as we saw previously, and I believe it was beta, when they tried to nerf it, it wasn't that large of a nerf, actually, even though it was a tremendous area of frustration from a gameplay perspective. There's a lot of ways that they could fix up Disc Priest, but certainly fixing some of the bloat, not the complexity, but the bloat that exists for leveraging value out of Atonement has to be number one. I think that they're able to do this without impacting or destroying or messing up the good things that have happened to Disc Priest in a Mythic Plus environment, and Disc Priest should be first on their list, in my opinion, for talents for healers to be revamped. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Let me know some other frustrations you guys might have as we dig into a couple other talent trees with 10.1.7 approaching. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.